Hey everyone, it's Helen from SBA Deal Hunter. Today we have Chris West with us, an entrepreneur based in London who's acquired two businesses, a property business doing primarily Airbnb rentals and an outsourcing company, both that he acquired last year. Very excited to hear Chris's story today. Chris, it's great to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much. Great intro.
Thank you, thank you. Well, first, let's get started with your background. How did you get into buying businesses? What were you doing before?
Yeah, so a bit of a, I'll try and sum this up as quick as I can, but basically I graduated in 2013, went into a graduate scheme of a really well-known grocery retailer in the UK called Sainsbury's. Most are familiar with it. I worked for them for 9 years, had a really, really good career, and led very, very large teams in quite some senior leadership positions. So I learned a lot in that time. Got to 30 and I was at a bit of a crossroads. I was in a position where it was a really good job. It paid me well, great package. But I didn't want to do that forever. And my end goal was not to retire early, which lots of people did within that industry. So I had another business on the side at the time. I was running a wholesale company, which was just something on the side as a bit of a safety net. I resigned when I was 30 that year. I completed my resignation period in 3 months, went on to run that business solo for around 6 months after that. Decided actually it wasn't really the business for me. It wasn't really exciting, and yeah, didn't quite give me the get out and go every single morning that I really wanted. So I closed that down. But in that period, started to really get into M&A and understand, well, wanting to understand what people were doing that were going off out on their own, buying and acquiring businesses. How are they leveraging money? How are they sourcing those businesses, and how do they just structure deals? Just the whole thing end to end. So after about 6 months of really getting into the nitty gritty of that, I then acquired and went out to find the first business, which was the property business, which focuses on Airbnb rentals, as you introed. And towards the back end of last year, then acquired the outsourcing company as well. So it's been a really quick journey in the last 18 months, hoping to finalize an acquisition this year as well. And my plan going forward is to try and do one every single year if I can.
Wow, amazing. It's funny because I read a statistic that most searchers, it takes them 23 months to buy their first business, and you bought two in 18. So, wow, props to you. That's awesome.
Pretty quick. I don't let the grass grow under my feet. Sometimes it can be a bad thing. Sometimes it can be a good thing. I don't know, but I think one a year is achievable. It's an interesting time as it is in the US at the moment. In the UK, there is obviously always been a lot of businesses where people are coming up to retirement, but there is a huge influx this year. I mean, in the time that I've been looking the last 18 months, I've noticed a huge trend upwards in people wanting to retire. So it feels more and more like a buyer's market at the moment, given that obviously leveraging debt's really difficult. So it's exciting, and it's something I want to, really take hold of, which I intend on doing so.
I'm curious, but you feeling like it's a buyer's market. I think a lot of people in the US would say it's still a seller's market, in many ways because, it's really hard to find a good business still. I'm curious in the UK, do you find that there are fewer buyers? What is the general market like there? I'm just curious.
Yeah,
Is it less competitive, would you say? Curious.
yeah. It's interesting actually. I've met a lot of friends in the US on Twitter in this space, and I'm always curious with the same questions. And I think there are some stark differences in both markets across the pond. I think the biggest difference here that I personally have found is we're a lot more risk averse as a culture. We don't like risk in the UK. And I think trying to leverage debt if you're someone that's starting out a whole company on your own is a lot more difficult than it is in the US. So we don't really have an SBA equivalent, for example. So generally, if you're going out to finance deals, it's either cash from your own pocket if you're in that, fortunate enough to have cash to do that, or you're leveraging against assets of your own or in the business that you're looking to acquire. But 9 times out of 10, you're always needing to have a personal guarantee on that loan. It's very,
Oh,
very rare now that you will have a loan of some form without a personal guarantee. Banks just don't want to take the risk in the UK from you at all.
yeah.
So that's probably one of the biggest differences. So obviously that makes it, naturally to the individuals out there wanting to start makes it, the barrier to entry really difficult. I would say it's very, very heavy on private equity in the UK. So there's a lot of roll-up strategies going on at the moment in various different verticals. So we're seeing a lot more of that, and that's increasing. So obviously that takes, if that's an industry you're wanting to go in where there's a big roll-up happening, it makes it super difficult because those businesses know they can be acquired by a PE fund and typically can get a bigger multiple. So it makes it quite hard. Is it competitive? Yeah, I don't know if it's as competitive as the US. I feel like the US have woken up to this a lot more than the UK have. I think that will change over the next 5 to 10 years. I think people are wise now to what's going on and how they can structure this type of acquisition entrepreneurship now and move into this. But at the moment, it doesn't feel like it's as top a priority as it certainly is in the US.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what about multiples? Like where do you see things sort of, how do you see that compare?
I think one of the mistakes I made if I look back on my acquisitions, one of the mistakes I made early on was focusing on sort of million revenue and less businesses, so kind of that area. And I went into that originally thinking, great, these businesses are turning over still a reasonable amount of money, they're cash flowing, they should be easy to leverage on. Not the truth in the UK at all. They're almost like a no man's land. No one really wants to look at them. They're really, really difficult to leverage against. So you're almost kind of having to bargain on a couple of things in those deals. A, that you've got the cash to get into them, but also that the seller is either willing to do a buyout, sorry, an earn out, or some form of seller note, seller financing. The other thing into sort of under a million revenue is those businesses, and I've spoken to a few people in the US and they agreed with this, they're always valued a lot higher than potentially some of the businesses as 2, 3, 4, 5 million revenue. And the reason is there's so much growth potential that's always attached to those sales. And technically, they're always more of an emotional sell. The sellers are normally more attached to those businesses. They want as much as they possibly can get for them because they've worked really closely with that business for such a long time. So yeah, those ones are always interesting. That's kind of where I cut my teeth into this first. That is not where I'm going to focus on in sort of the medium term now. And I'm starting to look at businesses in sort of the 5 million revenue mark. So anything that's generating 5 million plus, those EBITDA margins can be anywhere from sort of a million, 2 million as well. Those businesses are a lot easier to leverage against, generally because their receivables are a lot larger generally. And normally in those businesses, you've got assets to leverage on within the company as well. So they seem to be a lot easier to get funding for, as opposed to where I first started, probably being the two biggest differences. But it was a really good learning because it's steered me into what my next sort of move looks like and where my focus now and where my efforts are in my research and where I think I'm going to be heading in the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
No, that's super interesting to understand. I guess, you kind of spoke about the size of business. When you went into this initially, what was your buy box like in terms of, industries? You bought a property, sort of, I guess, almost like property, I guess, short-term rental type of business. Did you know that's the kind of business you wanted to buy? Did you cast a pretty broad net? What did that look like?
Yeah, I think from the offset, I cast a pretty broad net. I've always been quite industry agnostic in my approach. I've got certain criteria that I like the businesses to meet, and I was always kind of the opinion that providing those businesses met that criteria, I'm happy with it. I guess why I fell into sort of the property and the outsourcing business, I felt there was a lot of skill set and transferable skills that I'd personally had that fit within those businesses in some way. So I felt quite comfortable going into them. I guess what I didn't explain previously is I'm very hands-on when I first acquire, and I probably am for the first 12 to 18 months. I'm very much of the opinion that I like to get my hands dirty. I like to understand those businesses from the inside out, because I think that's the best way of building a team. Um, I need to know those businesses. I need to understand the pain points. I need to get close to customers. So I guess from the offset, I wanted to be comfortable in a business that I was going to start doing that in. And those two industries were pretty comfortable, but I'm still not really niche down. I'm still pretty industry agnostic. I'll look at businesses that again still fit within that criteria. But the only thing that's really changed now is the size of business I'm looking at.
Got it. Tell me more about the criteria. What are some of the things you're looking for?
Yeah, so it's kind of some of these might be red flags to some people. It's quite interesting bouncing these off when I'm speaking to individuals in this space. So, um, I guess first and foremost, I like businesses that have been incorporated for longer than 5 years. 5 to 10 years is the sweet spot. If they're at 10 years plus, that's great because the risk is somewhat muted. But they've also then had a demonstrated history of performance, and you can look back over a period of time before COVID, and of course after, to get a really good holistic view of the business. So that's a really important one for me. I don't mind founder centric businesses. I don't mind where the owner's been involved too much, providing that I can see there's been some great growth trajectory and it's not tied necessarily to relationships that have been built by the founder. I think if there's a business that's been built that way, but the relationships aren't tied to the individual that started it, and there's a way of getting a team in there to kind of take control, I'm cool with that, and I can see the vision for that business. So that doesn't really put me off, and I'm still happy to have that as a criteria. That if there's been a founder that's been at the center of it, fine. If there's a team already in place, fine as well. I can work with that. I'm just trying to think what other things I really look at. I guess, okay, so this is what I'm sort of like toying with now. Originally, I wasn't so concerned about having a defined lead generation or sales system. And what I mean by that is the businesses that I originally went for and I was looking at had grown really well organically. They'd had word of mouth, referral, and organic reach, which was, the real sort of bolster of the business, which was great. So there's product market fit. It's growing nicely. Customers aren't churning. People are telling them they're great. They're coming back. What those businesses didn't necessarily have was a rinse and repeat lead generation system in place. I kind of liked that because I saw there was a lot of untapped potential. So it meant that, there was lots of avenues you could go down to define a specific ICP or a specific sales generation route that would work for that business that could be rinsed and repeated. I guess what's been super difficult, and I don't know if it's been the landscape of last year and this year, is defining those systems quickly that enables you to scale quickly. And they feel like they're taking a lot more time at the moment to really niche down on who's the customer profile we're focusing on in those businesses and what's the marketing strategy which we're going to see some quick results with, but also see some quick return on investment as well. So I think going forward, and I've been looking at some businesses now where I'm actually holding that as a piece of criteria where I actually want to see some form of sales structure that could be lent on for the interim that's not just organic and word of mouth referral growth.
Right. Easier to go in if it's like, hey, this is already working, just do more of it, than try to figure out what's working to begin with. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think my mentality before was there's so much untapped potential in those businesses that haven't got that lead structure or that defined sales system that you could strike gold. The problem is, when do you strike the gold? And I guess the naivety for me in the first 12 to 18 months was probably actually, do you know what, that process takes a lot longer than I anticipated. But it's still exciting because you can take that business into realms it's never been before. But yeah, so I think I've added that as my criteria that I would really consider, a yes or no on the fact that does that have a sales system in place already?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, how did you come across your first deal? What were you doing to source deals, and what did your search look like?
To be honest, it was a cast far and wide net. I spent nights, days, weekends just relentlessly searching and looking on market deals. So there weren't really off market deals at the time. Reaching out to as many brokers as I could. So there's quite a lot of brokers in the UK that do advertise on the main sort of acquiring sites, but they've also got their own brokerage sites as well. And I got some really good relationships with those guys that they were feeding me obviously deal flow that was coming in through them, and felt they were good sort of fit for the criteria that I set out. It was just so much time and effort that I invested, which I still do now. I'm probably a bit more structured with it. So I'll set sort of times every single day still, amongst obviously the commitments I've got with the company so far, that I will sit and just do some real deep research into what's on the market. I do a little bit more off market now, but I'm still slowly edging into that realm. But to be honest, it was just a lot of time and effort. I was relentless with it.
No, it's definitely a marathon and not a sprint, right? I think that's the key with deal sourcing. I think people often come to me and they're like, oh, it's just like things came up and I just couldn't get to it. It's like things are always coming up and you just gotta allocate the time and just be consistent. So
I
um
think it's like, yeah, and do you know, I think it's like anything. People just they expect it to sit on, fall onto their lap tomorrow, and it's all of just going to happen naturally, and it just doesn't. It's the same with anything, right? We've all run businesses before, and acquiring businesses is no different. Great. It's the only difference is they've been running for a long time and they've got, a track history or a track record. But as I think you and I were talking before we started the call, Helen, they're really difficult to find. A good business is hard to find. It
yeah,
takes
totally.
time. It takes research. So yeah, lots of time. That's all I would say. That was that was the only thing that led me to those deals.
Speaking of time and research, how many deals did you, I guess, seriously look at before getting to your first deal? Did you get to like, I guess, even like LOI stage on any other deals, or was this the first one that you seriously pursued? I guess the property business. And then
Yeah,
later on, I guess the outsourcing business.
I think, yeah, I mean, the only thing I did tell myself when I was going out doing the research was not to have loads of real serious sort of conversations on the table because then it did get seriously messy. So I think what I ended up doing was a lot of the time was on the research, and then I would compile those lists, and I'd kind of keep track of who I'd reached out to and the stages I was at. I probably for the property business only had an LOI on maybe three before that. And I was probably closer to a five number of five before the outsourcing business. So not huge in terms of numbers, but enough that I could manage it. And I knew the stages I was at in terms of conversations with all of those. What I didn't want necessarily was a scattergun approach because for me, that didn't look like it was going to be hugely successful. And I didn't want to lose control of the whole process. I was happy having a bit of a scattergun approach with the research, but beyond that, I was quite strategic in going, right, okay, that's a number I want to focus on. I know I can manage that. I know that's going to lead me to the correct deal. And these businesses obviously sit within that criteria, but I don't want to stretch myself too thin.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess talk about the research. I'm assuming you're not referring to sort of like spending a lot of time doing market research on a deal, or are you referring more so to just being able to like look through a bunch of the deals that are new to market every day?
Yeah, looking through a bunch of the deals, I think what I still do now is if there's an industry that really piques my interest because I see a number of those businesses for sale, and the margins are great, growth's great, they look like really well established businesses, but there seems like there's a real opportunity in that industry. I'll then kind of flip my research into looking at what's that industry looking like at the moment, what's been the growth trajectory of it in the past and in the future, and just really go into a rabbit hole of what's the threats, what does that industry look like in the next 10, 15 years, and what's coming that could potentially look like a threat to that industry overall. So the research was like twofold. Yes, there was loads of time spent on finding the deals and doing a lot of research on the market, but then it was like, okay, what is this industry telling me? What has it told me previously, and where are we going with this? I think what's always interesting in the UK, which kind of I do more of this now, is looking at where the PE funds are heading because generally that's where I'll look and just be interested to see why they're doing that. Probably not somewhere I would go because it's really competitive and it will just be super hard to compete with the offers that they'll be getting out. But that's also quite an interesting way of kind of guiding my research and what's the activity in the acquisition space in the UK based on the private equity funds.
No, that's a smart sort of approach to just to in terms of digging into, because the private equity firms have done a lot of their own research into why this is a space they want to go into. So it's definitely helpful to dig into that. I'm curious, I guess, going into, both of the deals, what did you like about each? Maybe start the property business and then talk about the outsourcing business. When you started actually digging in, and now that you have more information from actually owning these businesses, what do you like about each?
Yeah, so the property business I liked because generally where I'm based in the UK, London and the sort of the southeast, property, albeit is expensive, there was a real market for Airbnb and it was growing really, really well. Obviously, post-COVID gave it a huge boom, but it's continued on really consistently. So that excited me. I had a lot of experience being a consumer myself for a long period of time in this area, and I'd stayed in different locations, and I could really, really see the growth trajectory in it and the potential. So it was kind of like a user experience myself I'd faced myself, which brought me to kind of going into that industry and that business. That's absolutely played to hand. It's been as good as I expected, if not slightly better. The growth trajectory of those properties at the moment has been great. I'm less focused on short-term rental now. I'm definitely more focused on Airbnbs. Airbnb for me is way more scalable. The cash flow of that particular sort of model is really, really good in the southeast of England. The short-term rentals are okay, not so much. It was kind of what I predicted anyway. I kind of thought that would be the case, so that hasn't really surprised me. But so far so good. That's worked out to be pretty good, and that kind of has almost been a bit of a grounding for further investment. So when I've acquired more businesses in the portfolio, longer term, I want to use more of that cash flow to be adding assets into the property business, and it's kind of a vehicle for those to sit in. Something that I've already established. I know what works. I've got contacts in the industry. As I was sort of explaining earlier, we've got a management agency that manages all of those properties. It might be something I do longer term, but at the moment it's not broken and I don't want to fix it. So it's something I can kind of just keep investing in over a period of time. So it's kind of almost like setting a foundation of a business that had already been sort of set up, but something I could keep adding to over time for investment. The outsourcing business was kind of similar in terms of like my headspace when I went to that. Again, there's a real interesting movement in remote work and has been since COVID. I don't see a huge change in the way that businesses are. I don't think we're going to go back, although the UK are trying to in some cases, but I don't think we're going to go back to all office work. And the need for remote work and global talent is just growing and growing. And that industry really excited me. And again, it was kind of from experience. When I was in corporate, we leveraged a lot of outsourced talent. Even a business as large as Sainsbury's, 200,000 colleagues and 35, 36 billion a year business, we're still outsourcing a lot of functions within that company. And it really got me thinking about the opportunity that would arise. And the top four can only be the top four for as long as they have been and will be, but there's got to be some challenges eventually. And I saw a lot of businesses doing some great stuff in the global talent space and wanted a slice of that. This business, what led me to it was that it met that criteria, but it had a really, really nice backstory. It had been running for sort of 7, 8 years at the time. So it was sort of meeting all the criteria. The other reason, kind of similar to the property business, I also bought this business not only just to scale it and continue the growth and eventually put a team in there, but it also gives me the foundation of some talent at my fingertips that I can utilize as the portfolio grows. And my thought process being that, a lot of these companies that I'm now be looking at are a lot more traditional. And we can also eventually centralize their finance functions, their sales function, their marketing function by utilizing the talent I've already got in that outsourcing business. So it enables me to kind of strip out costs in future portfolio companies and centralize more of those operations as well on a remote basis. So that was kind of there's like twofold thought process that company. I was thinking a lot of long term, but I was also thinking about, right, what's the short term benefit as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of synergies between sort of like offshore talent in general. Most small businesses could be leveraging more offshore talent, I feel, especially ones that just, haven't done it at all. I know we have a lot, so that makes a lot of sense. I guess I'm curious, with the Airbnb business, you're referring to short-term rentals. I guess in the US, short-term rentals and Airbnbs are almost pretty synonymous. I'm guessing you're saying short-term rentals are longer, like 6 to 12 months, or is that what you're referring to? And
Yeah,
Airbnb
six
is
to
more
12
like
months.
a got it.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah,
like about the
yes.
Airbnb model more? And when you bought the business, what was the team like? I think you mentioned you bought the real estate for the businesses earlier in our before we started the interview. Yeah, well, what did the business come with? Was it already coming with like a regular like great reviews on Airbnb, a lot of customers coming in every day, like great SEO, I guess, or what did that look like?
Yeah, so there was already a pretty established sort of listings for the business, sorry, for the properties on that in that business. Again, some were a blend of short-term rentals, so they weren't listed on Airbnb because they were sort of 12-month tenancies, for example. Others were Airbnbs. So the Airbnbs that were part of the portfolio had already established reviews and listings. We've actually amalgamated that into the agency that I brought on board to manage. They've kind of taken care of that and reviewed a lot of it and sort of centralized them and reviewed all of them and kind of done a bit of a revamp, to be honest with you, which has worked really, really well. They were performing okay before, but now these guys have taken over. They've done a fantastic job. Um, I love the Airbnb model because it feels like you get more control. You know, the properties are cleaned way more frequently. You've got control over that because you're obviously managing, or the agency are managing that process. It's way more profitable. So if you work on average in the southeast, the nightly rate that you could get, far providing you get decent occupancy, which we do generally do in the southeast, will far exceed the capacity you could have a monthly rental, which is obviously a lot better. So that's kind of like the two main reasons. There wasn't any more than, it's a really simple model, and they're the sort of things that I looked at, which again, as I say, has been great. The occupancy generally is anything between 25, 30 days a month. It really is
Wow.
crazy. I mean, two of the properties are booked up until the end of September. And we've got some small bookings in sort of November, December time as the Christmas period starts. So it's proving to be really, really, really lucrative. And it will only be something I continue to leverage on.
And how do you think about regulation when it comes to that business? And, obviously Airbnbs have been sort of banned in a lot of different places, or like under 30-day rentals are banned. How do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that it started to creep in a little bit in the UK. And obviously, we've just had a new government um, bought in who are, I don't know, anti second home, but I think they'll probably do more with this space than the previous government will. So it'll be interesting to watch. One thing that is okay and it looks to be safeguarded is property within limited companies seem to be okay. They don't seem to be able to touch those quite as easy. And from what I understand, and I'm not, don't quote me on this, but is it's a lot harder for them to change the rules and regulations of those properties because it will affect a number of different types of businesses that kind of operate in similar industries that would have a huge impact on. So I don't think there's going to be any huge changes to the businesses that operate property. Where it seems to be a bit of a sticking point, and there have been some changes recently with we used to call, I think they're called furnished
Right.
holiday rentals. They've made a lot of changes to people that individually own those. So there's less costs that they can now offset. They've made it really, really difficult from a kind of tax profitability perspective to make those properties work for individuals. And I think that's where we'll see the market change because they don't want individuals owning more than one property. The companies, it seems to be okay. It is interesting to look at Europe, though. I mean, there's obviously a lot of fallout with Airbnb in a lot of European cities and countries at the moment because it really is killing the industry. Well, not killing the industry from a holiday perspective, but really hurting the industry from a locals being able to afford to live where they obviously are from originally, and it's making it really difficult. Not quite sure if we're seeing the same here yet, but it seems to be okay from a limited company perspective. And when I said earlier about me sort of researching not only the listings, but then going into deep research about what's coming in the future, I did do a lot of research with that with the property company as well to think about what's the risks that really could threat this business basically.
No, that's great. That's super interesting to understand. I guess with the outsourcing business, then, what were some things you liked about that business? And with, I guess when you bought it, was there a team already? Like, did you see opportunity to grow it? Did they have contracts with a lot of businesses already, or like, and what is the business model? Sorry for all the questions, but very, very interested. We've used some offshore or outsourcing businesses where, it's either like a one-time fee or a retainer. I'm curious to learn more about, how you think of all of those things.
Yeah, and it's good questions because it's exactly why I bought it, to why this was a little bit different. So Predominantly, the talent at the moment is in the UK, albeit we've started to leverage a little bit more globally, and we're testing that at the moment because we've had the business came with global clients, and it still has got presence globally outside of the UK. Um, I think offshoring is interesting. I like offshoring. I think there's definitely still a need for quality assurance. And what I liked about this business was the fact that it it focused on quality. It focused on quality of work, quality of service. We've all probably been there, right? Where we know that the freelancer marketplaces and perhaps some of the offshore talent can be quite difficult with quality guarantee, often communication, and potentially sometimes the work's has to be redone by someone else, and then you can't get hold of someone, and you get all these problems. What I liked about this business, it was a kind of like a managed service, so it kind of negated all of the problems that you typically find with offshoring, outsourcing, freelancer marketplaces. So that was a big tick in the box, and it operates on a model as pay as you use. So we do retainers, but actually what this is it's risk free. So basically companies join us, they can leverage one of the 9 services, so anything from sort of finance, marketing, legal, executive assistance, and admin, and they can join. They'll have a sort of an alignment call of as many of the specialists that they want to speak with, and then once they kind of feel comfortable with the one they've chosen, the work begins pretty much immediately, and they only pay for the time they use based on an hourly rate. This business also then, and we've kind of adopted this a little bit more recently, is it had the functionality to also provide them the insight to lifetime tracking. So you can see costs, you can see hours, you can see the task being completed on a particular day, month. If you've been with the business for longer than 6 months, you can look back as far as you want to. So you get a really good insight into all of that. So it gives the client a lot more control and a lot more guarantee that the work that's being said is being done is actually being done. And if there are any problems, there's a fallback of the service, as opposed to you being out on your own with the freelancer. So I really liked it for that. It's a challenging model, because you don't always have the recurring revenue like a retainer-based model does, but it does spread your concentration risk because you're not putting all of your eggs in retainer models with certain companies. You've kind of got a spread concentration because you're working with lots of different clients across different industries and different services. So there's kind of like a double-edged sword with that. The model's difficult from a cash flow perspective sometimes, but actually concentration-wise, it's really attractive.
No, that's super interesting because oftentimes when you do have obviously one of the great things about, recurring revenue and having contracts and retainers is just predictable revenue and predictable
Yeah.
cash flow. But oftentimes you do see a lot of customer concentration in those situations with small businesses at least. So no, that's interesting. With I guess with both businesses, you mentioned your model is you go in the first 12 to 18 months. What was the transition like for these businesses? Was it everything you kind of expected during diligence? How did you, what was that like when you first took over?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk a bit of context as kind of the due diligence and some of those processes as well that led to that. So, I mean, yeah, everything's kind of panned out as expected. I actually do all the due diligence myself. I'm very, very comfortable with that, and I'm my abilities within that realm are pretty strong. So I generally always do my own due diligence. It will often take longer, but most times, and certainly these 2 transactions, the sellers were fine with that. They did have other offers on the table and other conversations, but it worked out well. Um, and based on those, it's worked out pretty well. Both businesses, I mean, obviously the property business is slightly different because it's obviously got assets, but both were really, really strong in terms of the debt position. The outsourcing business, for example, had no debt. So I like those types of businesses because I think, well, actually, if it doesn't work out in the first 6 to 12 months and we need to raise some working capital, we can do that because there's no debt originally. And that enables me to fuel the growth a little bit easier. I guess the only thing, sort of backtracking slightly on there, the only thing that I do, for want of a better word, outsource is the legals. And we've actually got really interesting legals in the UK now. And there's a lot of challenger sort of services coming. So we actually used a company that were not a traditional lawyer, and they've come into the market about 5 or 6 years ago, originally focused on helping businesses raise for startups and scale ups. And then over the last sort of year to 18 months, they've now gone also into acquisition legals. And what they do is they give you a lump sum cost, which is probably half what a traditional lawyer in the UK would cost you for acquisitions. You get sort of as many one-to-one calls with a centralized solicitor, legally trained professional that's working with you on your deal, and they will provide all of the templates for you, but obviously make them bespoke to that transaction. And it was phenomenal. I used them on both occasions with the seller. The cost was honestly so much more cost effective on both occasions. And I will continue to use them on all of the deals, providing that it works out well on sort of larger deals. Obviously, that'll be remain to be seen when I get into those. But yeah, I mean, it's worked out exactly as I expected on sort of all of that sort of pre-acquisition and post-acquisition.
And how did you learn? How long did it take for you to learn the businesses? Like how long were the sellers remaining involved in the businesses? What did that look like?
Yeah, so slightly different in both cases. So the property business was pretty straightforward. So I wasn't too concerned about a long handover period with that one. So with that business, that was just a month handover with the previous owners, which was more than enough. It was pretty straightforward. I wasn't too concerned in coming into that market, and it wasn't too complicated. So that was just a month handover, and then there was a 2-year earnout structure, which is still ongoing at the moment. And then the outsourcing business was slightly longer. So again, it was a 4-week handover period, which was full time between myself and the previous co-founders. And then that ended, and then it went to a certain amount of time we'd agreed for the following 6 months after that. It's more like a consultancy period. So those hours we agreed in those 6 months were free. And then if it went over that, we had an agreed hourly rate we'd pay, but that didn't ever happen and it wasn't exercised. We actually had a really good transaction. Both of us were sort of were really fair on both terms in the end, and it was a really nice deal, that one. They're also on a 2-year earnout structure as well, so that's still ongoing until this year and next year.
That's interesting. I guess to your earnouts for both, was there any seller financing involved or anything like that in addition to that? Um, how
No,
did
so I guess, I mean, like talking about sort of the sub 1 million revenue deals, I guess what it required was a lot more skin in the game from me than potentially it would in the larger deals. So I've got, you know, I got into both of these deals with cash of my own to begin with, and then the remainder of which were obviously then leveraged on part of the earnout. So no seller finance in both of those deals and no leverage debt either.
Interesting. So did you work with a bank at all for for those two deals? Or you're saying,
No, I didn't work with a bank at all. The only thing I did do, and I made a lot of really good connections with this, and as a finance broker that I still work very closely with now with up and coming deals I'm looking at and acquisitions. Um, Working with directly with banks, I would say, is pretty difficult in the UK. They probably won't work with people as small as me because the risk is higher. And generally, the larger banks directly, I might be wrong on this, but from my experience, I couldn't find this at all. But generally, the larger banks in the UK directly don't offer acquisition finance. So you're quite often forced at this level to go down the bespoke finance broker route, which is good because those guys have access to loads of product on the market. They see acquisition deals all of the time and they can almost guide you in sort of what's the best way of structuring that from a debt perspective. So I learned a lot about that because I worked really closely on both of these deals actually with this finance broker, but it ended up actually being better that I got into them first, and then in a year or 2 years, I could then leverage the cash back out. But dealing with the banks directly, no, I didn't. And I don't think I will do. I think I will always stick to the bespoke route because these guys have got a better offer in terms of the products they can look at and the access they've got, as opposed to going direct to the banks. And actually, a lot of the lenders these guys work with, they always lead back to the larger banks anyway. So you're kind of dealing with them indirectly, I guess, but not directly.
no, that's super interesting because it's always in the US, most people go SBA, so it's interesting to hear kind of how people are financing the deals when there isn't such, a program like the SBA program. Um,
Yeah, and do you know what? That experience it was pretty stressful because to the point where you're like, okay, I need to make a really difficult decision now. I leverage my own assets, I use my own cash, or I just pull out of the deal altogether. So that was the risk I took. And it was a shame because you kind of go into it thinking, yeah, great, I could probably put a small amount down and leverage the rest. And then sort of get further into the research and find that's probably not quite as easy in those 1 million sort of revenue mark deals. It was a bit of a, yeah, it wasn't great. It was one of those things. But what it really enabled now is that has really steered the direction and where I'm heading next. So I know now that the more traditional businesses where they've got assets like a fleet, or they've got property or manufacturing facilities or plant and machinery, those are the ones now where I really want to look at. And I guess I probably didn't look at those enough before because they were big numbers. They're bigger revenues, bigger EBITDA, bigger businesses overall. And I guess there was probably an element that I didn't want to jump into that as my first deal. But certainly now those are the ones that I'm looking at most, because you can be way more creative. You can look at sort of the sale and lease back on the properties. You can look at leverage against the fleet or the machinery, and they are a lot easier to get into. Not really easy, but definitely a lot more easier than the sort of the sub 1 million revenue mark deals.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, even in the US, right? Like it's hard to even get an SBA loan for a deal that's sub a million in purchase price. And a lot of banks just won't do it because it's riskier. And when you do have assets, it is easier to get a conventional loan as well. So totally, I think the same sort of general logic applies. So that's interesting to hear. I guess with the diligence process, how long did it take you? When you actually went under LOI, how long did it take you to close the deal? What was your process like? You said you did most of the diligence yourself. What did that look like? What did you dig into?
Pretty much everything. I was probably annoying the sellers a lot in the end, but I was pulling everything apart. I guess the biggest focus I wanted was to really understand probably three elements. I wanted to know what the performance was pre-COVID. That was really important to me. Because a lot of those businesses, and actually any business I would do this for, I still do it now. I want to see, 3 or 4 years prior to COVID, if they've been operating that long. And generally, if it met my criteria, they would have been. So I did a lot of analysis pre, during, and post, just so I could get a feel that if there was a hockey stick effect, was it really, really bad, or was it explainable, and is the trajectory back to where it was previously? And if not, why? So that was important for me. Looking at sort of what was the seller taking out personally over those years, so whether it was costs and benefits they were putting on the businesses, was it dividends? I wanted to have a really good understanding of what that looks like over that trajectory as well, because for me, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, obviously it gets adjusted in the EBITDA figure, but sometimes that can really, really skew the business. And it's always a bit of a battle because a lot of those scenarios, the sellers and the brokers that are working for them are saying, well, actually, that's just a capital expense. And actually that profitability, regardless of whether the seller's taking it as a dividend, is still going to pass on. So there was always, I always wanted to make sure that that was explainable, and there was a bit of a trend to follow with that. And then also just the debt, looking at what, was their history of debt? Have they raised before? If they have, what did that look like? And was there a potential, if there wasn't debt in the business at the time of acquisition, was there potential to raise money for working capital in 6 to 12 months? Generally in the UK, you find it difficult to raise money within a business, whether it be loan or, or those types of facilities, less than having 6 months of directorship. There are lenders that will look at you at 6 months. Again, your pool of lenders is really small at that stage. When it gets to 12 months of directorship, it gets a lot easier. So you've got way more open offers on the market, way more lenders that will look at you, and the terms get a bit more favorable as well. So my idea was, okay, if we're buying businesses with no debt, can we hold on for a year? Are we going to be able to sustain the performance? Are we going to be fine from a cash flow perspective? So that was also kind of part of my due diligence process, as well as kind of like forecasting performance and making sure we're okay to that sort of annualization period of, right, if we need some capital, we can now get it.
Yeah.
I would say it probably on average, I would say I probably spent a solid 2 weeks in some cases in both of those. And that was real, a real solid 2 weeks of deep diving absolutely everything. I think I focus more on this in the outsourcing business, but client concentration and sort of long, LTV of those clients was really important. And I wanted to know how long how long they've been with the business. I spoke to quite a few clients to get understanding of service. I don't always go by that because obviously you can cherry pick, but it gives you a good understanding of how their experience has been. But client concentration and LTV was a really, really big one that I spent also a lot of time in the outsourcing business. More so as well because it wasn't a retainer-based model and it was more pay for what you use and on-demand model. It was really important to see how long people were sticking around for.
No, that's interesting. And I guess going back to the transition period, or I guess jumping forward again, you mentioned that, your goal is eventually to own multiple, buy, one business a year. Obviously, you can't be operating all these businesses. You're going in for the first 12 to 18 months, being more hands-on, and then I guess bring on an operator or internally promoting someone, I'm guessing. How's that worked out? How challenging has it been to find someone to run the day-to-day that's not you?
You know, not that challenging yet. And I know this will change in time going forward, but the property business, realistically, I had a really good deal with the management company that have taken over everything. I almost feel like they're a bit like an operations agency. So not only are they managing the listings, the bookings, they're doing absolutely everything. So they're kind of like the team. And I don't really need individuals running that company that are employed by me. And I think if I did do that, I would only do that at a stage where it was, it really made sense to do so. I think if I brought salary team members into that business now and removed the agency, the margins definitely wouldn't be as strong. I'm getting better performance in terms of cash flow perspective and profit from the agency than I would a hired team. So I'll probably stick with that model for the next 5 years at least. The outsourcing business has been okay. I've kind of jumped, I kind of lucked out a little bit. I had a couple of individuals that have worked for some competitors in London for quite some time and have held some really interesting roles and some directorships within those businesses, but are wanting now to join businesses in the same space, but with the trajectory that they would go into an MD role. So I had a couple of really good conversations with some individuals that are looking to come on board to basically take that over. And the way that will work is we'll probably bring into some sort of client relations director role with the idea in sort of 6 months from them coming into the business, they can then progress to the MD role and I can then basically remove myself completely. So so far it's been actually okay. I know that's not normally the case, and I know that I've just lucked out entirely in both of those scenarios. But yeah, pretty positive experience to be honest with you.
And how many months into the outsourcing business are you at this point? What's sort of how many months from now do you plan on sort of being out of the day to day?
I think so. Realistically, the handover period finished at the beginning of December. December is a bit of an unusual time in the staffing world because obviously you shut down for basically 2 weeks and your clients do as well. So I really use the barometer of the beginning of January as a time frame. So I'm looking at bringing on someone September, which is good because generally as a rule of principle and the last 7 years would demonstrate this, although it's obviously never guaranteed, that September is a really good period for the growth to kick back in again. So September is when someone will be coming in to take on that role. And then realistically, I would like to be pretty removed from this business January, at the very latest April next year. So the 12 to 18 month mark.
Wow. I know I can't believe we're already over on time. This is just flown by, but last question if you don't mind. I'm curious, I guess, with with other people who are looking to buy businesses, I'm sure you've spoken to a lot of folks on Twitter or X and just other folks looking to buy businesses. Any sort of, you know, final words of advice from your experience going through this process twice now? And any sort of any pieces of advice there?
Yeah, where do I start with this? So there's obviously a narrative, right? It's become, I think, people are becoming wise to it in terms of this, acquisition entrepreneurship, which is great because buying businesses is exciting and it does give you an asset that could potentially grow if you're willing to put the work in. And that's exactly the point. You have to put the work in. Whether you're wanting to go into this with the idea that what I do is get hands-on, build a team, or you're buying a business with a team, I personally believe it still takes a lot of work. You've got to be prepared to put in the hard yards, whether that's the hard yards of researching, the due diligence, and all the processes that follow from that before you get the business. But after that, the work doesn't stop. You've got to put the hard yards in to make sure that that business continues to flourish and it meets the goals of growth that you are setting out. My worry is there's lots of people coming into this space that are looking for it to be passive because it's already got an existing team, and they're looking forward, to it being quite hands off and relatively easy. I personally don't believe that's the case. I think you've got to go into this knowing that it's going to be damn hard work. It's not a quick way to generate wealth. It might be quicker than starting something, but you've got to give yourself a realistic horizon, whether that's 10, 15, 20 years to seriously generate some wealth in this business, in terms of acquiring companies and whatever else. I think it's also very important to have a North Star. So whether that's you're building a whole company to exit in 20 years' time for a value that you've attached, or you're looking to just acquire a number of companies that are going to cash flow forever and sustain a lifestyle and sustain that model for you so you can keep rinsing and repeating that cash flow as time goes on. But being really clear from the offset, from day one, what it is that you want to achieve out of this is super important. And I think that keeps you wedded to the right direction that you want to head in. My other final point on it is the no cash deals exist. Obviously, there is a lot of talk around getting into businesses with no money down. My experience in the UK is it non-existent? No. Will it take a long time to find those potentially? And again, if you want to find a good business, which is difficult enough to find anyway, a good business that the sellers don't want any cash, and you can get them to agree to seller financing or an earnout, or you can leverage debt to a point where it can get you into that company with no cash, it's going to be super difficult to find. So whilst there's a big narrative everywhere talking about this, I would just say be realistic that is not always the case. People and you will still need to put skin in the game, whether that's personally guaranteeing finance, whether that's putting cash of your own in, whether that's just putting the hard yards into making that business or your portfolio longer term with success. Just don't underestimate any of those things would be my kind of overarching feedback based on what I see here and have experienced in the last 18 months.
No, I love that. I 100% agree with all 3 points. Just my own feedback is I think the 100% absentee business is not real, especially in the early days. You just can't expect to just buy the business and never show up and just kind of expect it to run itself and grow. I think that definitely is a misconception that I hate that it's like somehow made its way around the internet for some reason. And the North Star point is totally valid too, because if you're looking to buy to sell to private equity, you're probably looking at different types of deals. Maybe you're rolling up in the same industry versus just buying one-off random deals that are cash flowing. Definitely changes, what you're thinking about in terms of your own strategy. And yeah, the no money down thing, it's funny. It's one of the things that really bothers me too, because if you're serious about buying a business, it's just you want a deal to happen and you want it to happen sooner rather than later. I think going in with the mindset that you're just going to buy it with no money down and no strings attached is kind of like a fairy tale. So I
100%.
completely agree with
100%.
all 3 points. Yeah, I love that. Well, Chris, look, I know we're over already today. This has been, great. I really learned a lot from you, and I'm sure other people feel the same way. So, thank you again for your time. I guess if people want to reach out, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
The best way is probably on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter, pretty active on LinkedIn. They're probably the two social medias that I spend most of my time posting and visiting and connecting with people. So yeah, I mean, obviously they would be the two best to catch me. And I'm always interested in speaking to people, whether it's in the UK and the US, because it's a great community of people out there. And the couple of people that I've met so far, I talk to them most days on WhatsApp, and I can bounce deals off them. And I've learned so much in how to be creative with deal structures by speaking to other people. It's been brilliant. So yeah, they'd be the two best ways of catching me. I'd love to connect.
Look, I appreciate you, paying it forward. despite being so busy, obviously running two companies. So I'll definitely link your social media profiles with the interview. And Chris, thank you again for your time today. Really, really do appreciate it. And let's please stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for having me on, Helen. I really appreciate it. It's been great to chat. Really enjoyed it.
Yep. Yep. Thanks again.